Welcome, welcome, welcome to our English-speaking union happy hour, Red Line with Joby Warrick. I'm Joshua Keppel-Gonzalez, Director of Branch Services at the English-speaking Union of the United States. Today's happy hour is sponsored by the Philadelphia branch of the ESU. As ideas for these lectures come from you, our members and viewers, please share any ideas or topics for an upcoming speaker tonight using the survey that will appear at the end of our program. Before we get into that program, I want to make a couple of quick technical announcements. After the presentation, we will be holding a question and answer session. You can enter your questions into either the Q&A module or the chat module. Buttons to access both of these are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can do this at any point during the presentation. It doesn't have to be during the Q&A portion. We will get to the questions in the order received. In addition, we will be running a raffle tonight for 2 copies of Joby's books, so be sure to stay through the Q&A to receive one, to win one, the opportunity to win one. As well, Joby is offering the opportunity for to send out book plates as freebies. So details on that will be in the follow-up email that will go out tomorrow if you'd like to receive a book plate from Joby. I also want to take a moment to recognize the branches with the most registered members for today's happy hour. They are the Atlanta, Central Florida, and of course the Philadelphia branch of the English-speaking union as well. Now, to really start us off today, I'd like to welcome the treasurer and longtime member of the Philadelphia branch, William Jordan. Will?
Oh, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Here's just a brief biography of Joby Warrick. He's a best-selling author and national security correspondent for the Washington Post. A 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, he served for 24 years with the Post National Investigative Staff, reporting from Washington and scores of cities around the world. In addition to his latest book, Red Line, which, by the way, you can get at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and your neighborhood bookstore. You'll understand the plug from me at the end. In addition to this latest book, Red Line, he's the author of 2 previous nonfiction books, including Triple Agent from Doubleday 2011, a New York Times bestseller about a CIA operative in Afghanistan, as well as Black Flags, Doubleday 2015, a narrative account of personalities and events giving rise to the Islamic State. Black Flags was listed as one of the best books of 2015 by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, and numerous other publications, and was recipient of the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. In more than 2 decades at the Post, Warrick has written extensively on topics from Middle East conflicts and terrorism to nuclear proliferation, climate control. His article about illicit weapons trafficking won the Overseas Press Club of America's Bob Considine Award for the best newspaper interpretation of international affairs. Before coming to the Post, he was an investigative reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer, where he co-authored Boss Hog, a series about factory farming in the Southeast. This is the series that won the gold medal for the Pulitzer Prize gold medal in 1996. Prior to that, Warrick was foreign correspondent at the United Press International in Eastern Europe, where he covered the collapse of communism in the late 80s and early 90s. Warrick graduated from summa cum laude from Temple University in 1982 with a BA in journalism. He's a native of North Carolina, has 2 adult children, and lives in the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. with his beautiful wife, who happens to be my sister. So that's one of the reasons we've got Joby today. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody who came. I hope that you didn't just come for the drinks. We do have a special cocktail on the menu for today, which is a red vodka sour, and it should be made with Russian vodka. And if you read the book, I think you'll understand why that is. But it's very much a pleasure to be with all of you again. I've been with the Philadelphia chapter of ESU in the past, and it's a real treat to be introduced by my brother-in-law. Many of you know Will, and you'll not be surprised to know that he has a sister who's also wonderful and charming and fun to be with. And to top it all off, the family was nice enough to let me be part of it. So again, thanks to Will for being a host and also for being a great brother-in-law. I have a very challenging assignment today. It's this event is a happy hour, and yet I have to talk about Syria, which is probably the the most unhappy topic in the world. Fortunately, my book is not entirely a gloomy story. It's set against Syria as a backdrop, but it's really a narrative about a tragedy that did not happen. It's a story about a group of amazing characters, Americans, Europeans, Canadians, Syrians, all of them courageous, all of them very real, who found themselves in Syria during what was a global crisis, really, a civil war that was affecting all of the Middle East and all of Europe. And they were trying to basically defuse a time bomb, a threat that was aimed at the West that could very well have changed history if it had not been stopped. And unless you've read the book, there's a very good chance you've heard very little about it. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is set the stage for the story I tell. I'm going to introduce some of the major characters, and we'll travel along with them for a bit to get a sense of what they were like and why their actions proved to be so important, even if Americans don't really know their names. At its core, it's also a story about American ingenuity in response to a crisis. And some of the book's heroes are found in places where you would not normally expect to find them, such as deep within the bureaucracy of the US government and even at the United Nations. So hold on to your seats for that. I think you'll be as impressed with these personalities as I was. So I'm going to show you some photos as I talk, just so you can get a sense of what some of these people look like and just some of the places too that we're going to visit. So hold on one second. I'm going to get the screen up and running, and hopefully you can all see this now. But this is okay. Just one moment. Okay, I think we're all set. So anyway, my story starts in a strange place, which is a laboratory. And it's not just any lab, it's a military research facility whose purpose is to create a weapon of mass destruction for Syria's dictator. Now, a little bit of context here. Syria's arch rival, as you know, is its next door neighbor, Israel. Damascus fought a series of wars with Israel. They all went very badly from Syria's point of view. Israel has nuclear weapons and the region's strongest military. So in the 1980s, the Syrians decided to counter that by creating an arsenal of powerful chemical weapons. Now, these include extremely lethal nerve agents like sarin. Military sarin is 26 times more deadly than cyanide. And they also built delivery systems that were designed to send these chemical weapons into Israel in missiles and bombs in the case of a future war. So Syria spends a lot of money in the 80s building a network of secret labs to make these weapons, and they put some of their best and brightest minds to work to make this happen. The aerial photo on the right shows the biggest military lab, which is on a hilltop outside the capital, Damascus. So this is our setting. Now, inside the lab, and this is a portion of it, the older part built in the 1980s, we meet a most unusual scientist. His name is Ayman. And as a young man, Ayman obtained a scholarship to attend school in the United States. So he comes to America, he falls in love with America, he loves our people and our culture, and then he returns home to become first a weapons scientist and then a top researcher in this secret program to make lethal nerve agents like sarin. He's a bit of a quirky guy. He's a man who decided to be married to two women at the same time, which is something you can do in some Muslim countries and you can legally do in Syria, but it's very unusual for a professional, somebody in his occupation. And he talks about his odd family configuration to a visiting American in the snippet from the book. This is when we first meet Ayman in Red Line. He seemed compelled to justify his living arrangements as another man might explain an extravagant impulse purchase. His first wife was an excellent cook, he said, but decided to marry a second, considerably younger woman, secretary, out of a purely carnal attraction. Who could have foreseen such turmoil? The two women squabbled constantly, except for times when they united to direct their scorn at him. He wanted a spicier love life, and he ended up with a case of perpetual heartburn. I don't recommend it, he said. Now, at the time the story opens in 1988, Ayman has helped Syria develop a world-class weapon system with top-of-the-line equipment for making a full array of lethal nerve agents for warfare. And yet, Ayman also wore another hat. He was a spy for the CIA, as the book reveals, in an untold story that was never made public until just a few weeks ago when the book came out. He was recruited by the CIA in the late 1980s, and he passed secret information on to the Americans for more than a decade. And then one day, as recounted in the book, he decided to give the CIA a sample of his wares, a little vial containing deadly sarin that the CIA could take home and analyze. The transfer takes place in the front seat of a car, and it goes like this. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the scientist produced a small package. "It's nearly Christmas. You're a Christian," the chemist said, handing over the bundle. "Here's a Christmas present." A few minutes later, the American was left alone to ponder what was inside that parcel's plain wrapping. And of course, what was inside was the good stuff. Sarin, and I'm getting ahead of myself here. Just a little bit, a few grams. At that time, as he was giving this sample to the CIA, Syria was making the same poisons by the ton. And by passing secrets to the CIA, Ayman was alerting the Americans to what his government was doing. And he was also becoming very rich in the process because he's being paid by the agency. As the story unfolds, Ayman is betrayed. He trips up. And how and why that happens, I won't spoil the ending. I encourage you to read the book, but the story takes a dramatic twist in a way that seals Ayman's fate. Because of Ayman, years later, when civil war breaks out in Syria, the Americans understand a hidden danger that exists in this country. The information from the spy makes clear that this conflict is different from other uprisings that are taking place as part of the Arab Spring. And underground bunkers throughout this country is enough sarin to fill several swimming pools. And now the country is being literally torn apart by civil war. The government is losing control of the countryside. Military bases are being overrun. Some really bad actors are starting to move into the conflict. Groups like an Al-Qaeda offshoot that's called Al-Nusra, and later the Islamic State, ISIS. And as the country is unraveling, those weapons are becoming a grave threat, not just to Syrians, but to the entire world. It doesn't take much imagination to envision how even a gallon or two of sarin stolen from one of these underground bunkers, taken out of Syria in a truck, in a plane, or a ship, this could be the ingredient for a horrific terrorist attack in a sports stadium or a subway station in London or New York or in Washington. One attack like that could create massive numbers of casualties, and it would almost certainly increase the pressure on the United States and other Western countries to intervene in Syria's war. Now, clearly, this is a disaster in the making. And some frantic conversations are getting underway at the Pentagon and in capitals around the world, from the Middle East to Europe. And it's in this context, all this fretting about this disaster to come, we meet our next character. He's an Army chemical weapons expert named Tim Blades, and a lot of the book is about his adventures. Tim is a colorful character. He's gruff and profane. He's cantankerous. He has literal physical scars from accidental exposures to chemical weapons in his youth. But he's the Ray Donovan of the chemical weapons business. If chemical weapons are discovered in the United States or around the world, it's him and his team that are sent to swoop in and figure out how to make them disappear. In late 2012, Pentagon officials are struggling over what to do with Syria's chemical weapons, and they decide to meet with Tim. If somehow the Americans can get their hands on these chemicals, how can they get rid of them? That's a big if. No one yet knows how this might happen. But the Pentagon is making some rough calculations about what it might take if we could get inside Syria. How do you secure all those chemical facilities? Well, it would be very costly in terms of manpower. You'd probably need about 70,000 troops, the Pentagon estimated. And then you'd have to be able to protect yourself in Syria to fight off, attackers, Syrians, rebels, ISIS, whatever, as a war is going on. And even if that happens, even if you get the weapons out, what do you do with them? What do you do with all these poison liquids and gases? Tim thinks it over and says, I've got an idea. He huddles with his team in Edgewood, Maryland, and a few weeks later, have a blueprint for a new machine, a prototype. It's a portable machine that can fit inside 2 tractor trailers and be set up almost anywhere in the world. The machine neutralizes sarin irreversibly, and the construction costs are less than it takes to build a single Army tank. Tim builds this contraption. Some will call it the Margarita machine, and it works. The Pentagon orders 7 of them. They're built in a few months. They go into a warehouse, and no one thinks they'll ever actually be used. In the book, you see Tim complaining about this to his wife one day. We paid a lot of money to build 7 of these things, he said. Of course, we're never going to use them. But then, bam, was I ever wrong. As this is happening, something weird is going on inside Syria. There were reports of chemical weapons attacks in the Syrian countryside, but they're small and mysterious, and the evidence is a bit murky. Sometimes just a single person is killed or a small handful. It's as though the Syrians are experimenting, trying to figure out whether it's feasible to use these chemical weapons on a small scale in order to shift the tide of battle that's going very badly at the time. If it's true that they're using chemical weapons, it's a very big deal, of course. There's a global ban against using these weapons. And so in the middle of 2013, the United Nations sends a small team of experts into Syria to investigate these incidents. And it's in this context that we meet our next character, one of the heroes of the book. Åke Sällström is a Swedish medical professor and a veteran of weapons inspection teams in Iraq. He was the one that went to Iraq in the 1990s to look for evidence of weapons of mass destruction. He's tapped by the United Nations for what seems to be an mission to seek evidence of chemical weapons use in a country that doesn't even acknowledge having chemical weapons. He arrives in Damascus in August 2013 to press for answers, and he's completely stonewalled. We have no chemical weapons, the Syrians tell him again and again. Yet while Sällström is in Damascus, something extraordinary happens. On what the team believes is their last night in the country, there's a horrific new attack in the outskirts of the capital. The UN inspectors actually witness the attack as it's underway from their hotel window. The artillery rockets are launched from northern hills above Damascus, landing on targets to the south and to the east. And when dawn breaks the next day, it's clear this was no ordinary attack. More than 1,000 people have been killed by poison gas, many of them small children, killed still in their pajamas. Sällström's immediate impulse is to go to the crime scene and collect evidence. This is the reason he came to Syria in the first place. And eventually, he wears the Syrians down and he wins permission to leave Damascus and go to the rebel towns where the attacks took place. But he has to go unarmed, on his own, no military escorts, and no security. There's a fateful moment early in the expedition as the UN team's convoy is preparing to cross into no man's land. All of a sudden, the lead vehicle comes under attack. Bullets smack against its car frame, the tires, the passenger windows, the windshield. The glass is shatter resistant and designed to hold up against small arms fire, but only to a degree. Now it's starting to crack and weaken. The UN convoy quickly turns around and heads back to a military outpost. The narrative in the book picks up at a point where Sällström and two of his advisors are trying to decide what to do next. Mohammed Kafaji was the most familiar with the local terrain, so Sällström turned to him with his most pressing question. What do we do now, Mohammed? He asked. Kafaji didn't hesitate. We go in again, he said. What? Sällström was incredulous. If we don't go today, we'll never go, Kafaji said. We'll know they can scare us and your mission will be over. Sällström sat quietly thinking. He was being asked to send his team back down a road where a waiting sniper was merely the only threat of which they were absolutely certain. He thought for a minute. Okay, he said, we go in. Moments later, the Toyotas lined up again for a fresh attempt to cross into rebel territory. This one would look markedly different. Rather than cautiously feeling their way through no man's land, they would dash across it like inmates on a prison break. Kafaji grabbed the spare armored jacket and, scooching down into his seat, used his feet to press it up against the windshield. Team members in the other cars did the same. When everyone was ready, the SUVs passed through the checkpoint and tore down the narrow road with as much speed as the drivers could muster. The vehicle shot across the bridge and did not slow down until all four were on the other side. This time, no shots were fired. These are pictures of the actual vehicles. You can see the bullet holes in the windshield of the one up on the right. Now, Sällström presses on with his mission, and eventually he succeeds. Evidence is found and collected, proving conclusively not only that sarin was used, but it came from the Syrian side. The OPCW, which is the chemical weapons watchdog that sponsored the trip, wins a Nobel Prize after this mission takes place. Everybody expects the United States will now punish Syria with a missile strike, but that doesn't happen. This is the part of the story that most people know. But instead of a missile strike, a deal was struck, a deal between the United States and the Russians. Now, how that agreement came about is very complicated, and I get into it in my book. But in any case, the agreement called on Syria and the international community to do something that had never been attempted and which sounded pretty much impossible. There would be no missile strike if Syria would just submit to the removal and destruction of its entire chemical arsenal, its main strategic weapons system, in 9 months, in the middle of a war. In the book, we watch as a second international team is hastily assembled to oversee this mammoth task, to oversee the physical elimination of these weapons and getting them out of the country. And the team is guided by this remarkable Dutch diplomat, Sigrid Kaag. Kaag is a mother of four. She's a UN official. She has no military experience, no familiarity with chemical weapons, but she knows the region. She's a good manager. And most importantly, she's known to have the mental toughness to go head to head with the leaders of Syria's notoriously brutal, and I should add, very much male-dominated regime. Now, Sigrid quickly discovers that no one really thinks that this deal is going to work. No one really believes Syria is going to give up its weapons. And many countries would actually rather see the deal collapse, and then they can have their military strike. The fact is, Kaag would later say, almost no one connected to this mission really wanted it to succeed. We meet Sigrid in Syria at a particularly bleak moment in 2013. The book describes the predicament that she and her fellow inspectors find themselves in. There's been a freak autumn snowstorm that closed the mountain passes for nearly a week, blocking needed supplies coming to the country from Lebanon. Flatbed trucks were arriving for transport duty were found to be missing steering wheels and other key parts. Procurement offices struggled to find adequate numbers of storage tanks, cranes, forklifts. And the rebel armies, meanwhile, were suddenly on the march in the north and the east, harassing military convoys and advancing to within striking distance of the weapon depots themselves. And the Syrians, pliant at first, now balked at even minor requests, bombarding Kaag with a never-ending list of demands: more armor, more heavy equipment, more time. At this point, it wasn't even clear how the chemicals would physically be removed, or where they would go, or how they would be safeguarded along the way. The OPCW experts knew their job, but the agency lacked the resources or the expertise or even a good plan for eliminating 1,300 tons of chemical weapons. It was like bringing a patient to a non-existent hospital, Kaag would later tell me, or like trying to take a trip when there's no plane or no crew or no one who even knows how to fly. And yet the teams persist. They crisscross hundreds of miles of contested terrain, sometimes so close to the fighting that they can hear the salvos from artillery duels whistling overhead. Their hotel comes under attack. They're targeted by Al-Qaeda, and they're trailed by the Syrian secret police. And when progress with the Syrians appears to stall completely, they revert to being diplomats, haggling with the Russians, haggling with the Arab League, the Iranians, anyone who could nudge the Syrians a step closer to fulfilling their goal and their promises. Kaag and her deputies would drive across Damascus to seek help from the only two countries that possessed the clout to change Assad's behavior. Kaag became a regular visitor to the Russian embassy and also to the Iranian embassy, where the bearded ambassador would offer a sympathetic ear and trays of roasted pistachios, only to complain afterward that Kaag's dress was too short or that she allowed too much of her blonde hair to spill out from under the head covering she dutifully wore. Exactly what those visits accomplished was never clear, but eventually, as a result of all this pressure, Syria announced that it was beginning to move some of its chemicals to the port at Latakia. Things were starting to break. Change was so abrupt that Kaag's team had to rush to finalize arrangements for a pickup by volunteer ships from a half dozen countries that lay moored off Syria's coast, waiting for just this signal to come ashore. And sure enough, the chemicals began to be loaded to be taken away for destruction. In the end, Syria's declared stockpile, which ended up being about 90 to 95% of Assad's overall chemical stockpile, plus his equipment for manufacturing and production, is destroyed or hauled to the harbor to be taken out to sea. And yet when it's over, when the job is done, Kaag can't bring herself to be happy about it. She looks around and she sees that even though one particularly terrible weapon has been taken off the battlefield, Syrians are still getting killed every day from other weapons, from bullets and artillery shells, barrel bombs. On top of that, Assad starts quietly using chemical weapons again, not the really bad stuff, the nerve agents such as sarin that just got hauled away, but a poor man's substitute, chlorine. Chlorine is the ordinary industrial chemical that you use to purify drinking water or put in your swimming pool. It's not illegal to have it. It's not very powerful. It's not a good weapon. It doesn't kill a lot of people, but it's a terror weapon, and the Syrians start using chlorine to terrorize people. And so at the end, we see Sigrid and her colleagues feeling very mixed about what they managed to achieve. I hope the people of Syria can forgive us, she tells a friend one day. We didn't change their lives. But getting the weapons out of Syria is only half the struggle. What do you do next? Who will take the weapons and neutralize them? The answer is no one. Literally no one in the world. The Pentagon had its margarita machines, but you have to put them someplace. Where do you put them? What country is going to open a seaport to let toxic cargoes like this come in? So with literally no other options, the Pentagon decides that Tim Blade's margarita machines will have to go to sea. They get bolted onto the deck of an old cargo ship, and this is it, the Cape Ray, and Blades will be placed in charge of what will become the world's first floating chemical weapons destruction factory operating in the middle of the Mediterranean. This is not an optimal solution. This is not a great place to have thousands and thousands of gallons of the most dangerous liquids ever invented. It's bad enough to have them on land. And on the ocean, it's much worse. A ship at sea is constantly moving and flexing. The entire vessel pitches and rolls with the sea swell. Pipes and hoses get stretched and pulled. A big storm or a rogue wave could overturn everything, even the ship itself. Experts at the Pentagon called this idea harebrained. But in early 2014, the ship option was the only alternative that remained. So Tim Blades and his Maryland crew, most of them professed landlubbers, totally inexperienced at sea, climb aboard the Cape Ray and then load up their margarita machines onto the decks and prepare to do something that had literally never been done in history. There are challenges, including some big ones. There's a major equipment malfunction. Then comes a leak. Parts wear out because of the corrosive nature of the chemicals. And as the work progresses, most frighteningly, the ship becomes increasingly unstable because fuel is being burned off, and the fuel is what makes the ship stable. The ship is becoming more top heavy as more fuel is burned and as more chemical waste are loaded up into the upper decks. And there are real concerns about the possibility that the ship will capsize. Meanwhile, news stories about this chemical weapon ship is starting to go across Europe, and in the Mediterranean countries such as Italy and Greece, there's outrage and opponents start to organize. A flotilla of private vessels, protest ships, depart from Crete to hunt for the Cape Ray. And yet somehow it all works. After 42 days, the last of the barrels of deadly chemicals is destroyed. No one is killed or injured. The fish in the Mediterranean survive for at least another day. And yet all of the success is barely noticed the rest of the world. And that's because other crises were commanding our attention at the time. One was the rise of the Islamic State, which captures Iraq's second largest city, Mosul, just as the events in the Mediterranean are playing out. ISIS grabs the world's attention by beheading journalists and aid workers and all kinds of other things. And the United States and its allies go to war to stop them. If you read the book, there's a major storyline describing how ISIS, deprived of its chance to steal chemical weapons from Syria, decides to try to make its own chemical weapons. And you meet some really interesting characters in the book who are willing to help ISIS achieve this scary goal of becoming the first terrorist group with a production line for poison gas. I met one of these lovely people, a former ISIS weapons scientist on death row in an Iraqi prison, and he told me very willingly about what he had done and felt a bit of pride about it. As we found out, he was partially successful. ISIS actually succeeded in making some crude chemical weapons. Fortunately for us, they ran out of time. As coalition forces captured Mosul, they destroy the Islamic State's laboratories and kill or capture most of its scientists, including the one that I met. A few of them, however, get away. Meanwhile, war in Syria goes on, and the success of the Cape Ray is overshadowed by the continuing and unrelenting human tragedy in Syria itself, including the refugees, the boat people, and then the chlorine attacks, which is a reminder of the fact that Syria never really changed its mind or changed its intention about using chemical weapons, and would continue to use those and whatever else it could find, including ordinary chlorine, to make people suffer or to break the back of the opposition. There's never a real moment of accountability for Assad, the dictator, who never once acknowledges that he used chemical weapons at all. And yet, as bad as things are, it's important to remember and to think about the fact that things could have been even worse for Syria and for the world. If those 1,300 tons of chemical weapons had remained in the country, what a crisis we could have had. To this day, 10 years after the start of the Civil War, the deadliest single day in the conflict occurred on that morning in August 2013, when 1,400 people were killed in a sarin attack in the outskirts of Damascus. One attack, 1,400 deaths, and thousands of injuries. It's a reminder of how powerful those weapons are. On one of the last days of the Cape Ray's mission, crew received a congratulatory email from one of the team's leaders that summed it up pretty well. And I'll close with this. 5 months to create the first ever field deployable hydrolysis system, the Margarita machine. 66 days to outfit the vessel. 42 days to destroy hundreds of tons of Syria's most dangerous chemical weapons at sea. The number we will never know, the number of men, women, and children in Syria who were saved from death by chemical weapons. Thanks for coming along on my journey and meeting a few of my favorite characters. I hope you've been able to get a flavor, and it's really just a flavor, of the kinds of challenges that were faced and overcome under excruciating circumstances to save the lives of people who had no idea and still don't that they were ever at risk. These are true heroes, and to me, I was honored to get to know many of them and tell their stories. So thank you again for your time and attention. I'd be happy to take a few questions if anyone has any about the book, about the situation in Syria, the reporting and writing, anything that's on your mind. Thanks again.
Thank you, Joby. Yeah, I think you summed it up in your kind of introductory remarks, a kind of grim subject to broach for a happy hour, but I think you did it very well. Thank you. It was very intriguing. We do have some questions that have come in already. I'd just like to remind everyone, if you do have a question, please enter it into either the Q&A module or the chat box, and we'll get to them in the order received. Our first question is from David Coslow, who asks, does the ICC, International Criminal Court, have a part in your story?
Well, they haven't yet, and that's a really good question, and I appreciate you asking that, because the accountability problem with Assad is one of the thornier, most difficult problems of this whole story. Because ordinarily, in a civilized world, there would be accountability, there'd be a criminal process. There certainly have been investigations that have determined that chemical weapons were used. They were used again after Assad supposedly surrendered his chemical stockpile and agreed to become part of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which means you can't have them, you can't use them. He uses them anyway. So where's the punishment that comes with that crime? And the problem is, Syria has two of the most important allies it could possibly have, and the most important of all, of course, is Russia. And Russia has steadily blocked any attempt to hold Assad to account. It's blocked punishment at the UN, and it's blocked any kind of punishment at the ICC. Eventually, though, we have to hope that eventually their justice can be prevailed, and that's not necessarily naive, because situations do change in this part of the world. And if we think back to the Bosnian conflict in the 1990s, it took 20 years for some of the real bad actors in that conflict to face justice. But eventually they did. They ended up at the Hague. They appeared before a tribunal. They were found guilty, and they're serving sentences. So one has to hope that as the situation evolves, that someday Assad and his henchmen will meet the fate that they deserve.
So our next question is from Katie Brill, who asks, who's starring in the movie?
Well, so I've been lucky in that all three of my books have been optioned for films. Black Flags got pretty far. We had interest from Bradley Cooper, the actor, who actually came to my house one day with Todd Phillips, one of his friends, and they made a pitch that they wanted to make a film version of Black Flags, probably a limited series for TV. And they managed to get HBO interested, and contract was signed, and we had a pilot commissioned, and a director was hired. And so we were off to the races. And then there was a sort of corporate merger. HBO and AT&T merged, and they cut a lot of projects. And this one was one that unfortunately went on the rails, because it was thought that this was just so dark of a subject. Who was going to want to watch a TV show about terrorism? But so that one went away. Redline is, shall we say, there are active discussions currently, and a name that you would all recognize is very interested in doing something with it. I can't talk about it, but I just would say, watch this space. Hopefully, we'll have some news to announce soon. And my my interest is, as an author, I just feel this is a fantastic story, and I'd love for it to be available for a larger audience. And if it's told well and with quality and with fidelity to the facts, I'd be just delighted. So hopefully that'll happen. We'll see.
Great. So our next question from Ruben Johnson, who asks, there were reports after the chemicals were supposedly removed that Syria had used chemical weapons. Were these only chlorine? How can we be certain that all chemicals were removed?
Well, we're pretty sure they weren't. And that became clear as time went on. Initially, Assad just did this sort of the poor man's thing. He just used chlorine. He used it a lot. There's some groups have calculated about 300 incidents of chlorine use after 2014 when they weren't supposedly using anything. And in the United Nations, the rest of the world essentially shrugged because you can't outlaw chlorine. It's illegal to use it in that sense, but with Russia taking Syria's side, there's just no evidence, no way that any serious prosecution was going to be mounted. It turns out later, much later in 2017, Syria reveals that it did indeed keep some sarin, and that was already suspected by the time this operation, the Cape Ray operation, ended. The CIA already believed that some residual amounts of the bad stuff, nerve agents, were kept aside and were hidden someplace by the regime. And sure enough, in 2017, the Syrian government's under real pressure from the rebels. They're trying to break a siege in the north, and so they used sarin again in a town called Khan Sheikhoun. And the UN OPCW came in later and documented that this was not just that it was sarin, but it was the same sarin that the Assad government had made years earlier from the original stockpile. They could, with very good forensic techniques, could tell that it was exactly the same. And so, yeah, they did keep some of it aside. How much is open to speculation. The best estimate from our people, from our government folks that look at this, think that's probably something like 10 to 15% of everything he had, he kept and put away someplace. There have been more revelations of that nature. Some of the inspectors that are in the country have been kind of looking through files and opening cupboards in various facilities, have found traces of things that the Syrians weren't supposed to have. There's this terrible toxic element that's called ricin. You may have heard of it. It's actually made from castor beans, but it's extremely poisonous, and it's kind of a favorite for terrorists. They try to get castor beans and make a poison. Well, the Syrians turned out they had a ricin program, and they had weaponized ricin and didn't report it to anyone. Somehow went under the radar screen. But when these inspectors were in the country, they found evidence that ricin was indeed experimented with. The Syrians claimed that the program didn't work very well, and so they stopped and they destroyed all their stuff. And nobody knows whether that's true or not. So today there remains many unanswered questions about what the Syrians did in the past, how much they have now, what they might do with this stuff again. And that makes this continue to be a dangerous situation, and one that we could see ourselves involved in another crisis. So what if Syria next week decides to use sarin gas or chlorine or something else on a village in the north? I mean, what's the Biden administration's response? And so it remains a major subject of concern. I don't think that we've seen the last of this by any stretch.
So the next question is from Michelle Wang, who asks, in the US-Syria agreement, was there a guarantee for Assad? How would that affect future accountability?
So that's a good question, Michelle. The only real agreement, which is a crazy one, was that he didn't have to admit to anything. And this is kind of a feature of the system in a way. When these inspectors would go to investigate these attacks, they went in under restrictions that said, you can investigate whatever you want, you can reach your conclusions about what was used, but you can't say who used it. You could say this village was attacked, by helicopters, and chlorine or sarin was dropped and people died. Nobody is flying helicopters in Syria except for the regime, but we can't accuse the regime of committing this offense. And it seems ridiculous, but the reason those rules exist is because they have to have agreements on the front end in order to allow these inspectors to come into the country in the first place. And so these are the starting point. This was the starting point for some of these inspections, was that you can't accuse Syria of anything. And so that's allowed Syria to continue to claim that it's innocent, because no one has ever been able to, until very recently, it's a long story, but more recently they have been accused by government agencies. But they can say that no one has ever convicted them. No one has ever, found them guilty of using chemical weapons against their own people. And so they've never done it. And if you see something bad going on in this country, it's because of rebels or, Israelis have snuck something in, or somebody's out to get us, false flag operations. And that's really part of the sort of tragedy of this, is that despite all the atrocities that you see on TV and all the terrible things that have happened, Syria continues to say to this day that it's done nothing wrong, and it's just exasperating to watch.
So our next question is from Ruben Johnson, again, who asks, where did the Syrians get the expertise to make sarin?
And that's a good question, Ruben. And if you read the book, you'll see this amazing story in the beginning, amazing to me, and I hope you'll enjoy it. But it's in the prologue, the story of this spy that I talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, who was involved in the making of sarin and shared some of his samples with the CIA. My expectation going into this, that I was going to find that they had gotten Russian help, that the Russians had given them formulas, or that maybe Russian defectors or scientists who were leaving the country in the 90s had gone to work for the Syrians and given them stuff. And there's some evidence that a few kind of freelancers, there was one Russian general who made chemical weapons for the Soviet Union and then got himself a nice villa on the coast of Syria and then provided some material to them. But it turns out, and the CIA concluded this as well, that they got pretty good at doing it themselves. And the science of chemical weapons is not all that difficult. This is century-old stuff. And they played around with different things. And the sarin recipe that they developed is unique. It's real sarin, but they used a different set of ingredients, including a couple of things which wonderfully helpful to us, because no one else in the world has ever used the same recipe. So when we see, get a sample of some sarin that somebody used, you could tell right away if it comes from Syrian production, because we know exactly how it was made. But sort of the beauty, but also horror, is that they became quite good at making this themselves. And so no effort of restricting experts from coming into the country or helping them, or controlling exports or imports into the country. None of that could have stopped them ultimately from making chemical weapons, because the know-how is there and they developed them themselves, partly because some of their scientists went to good universities in Europe and in the West, and they're really, really smart.
So I believe our next question is also about Eamon. I think you may have captured the imagination of the audience. So this is from David Coslow, who writes, what happened to the spy with 2 wives and to his warring wives? I believe you kind of buried what happened to Eamon there, but that's our next question.
All right. Well, you're going to have to promise me you'll buy the book anyway. I'll shed some, I'll spill some secrets here. It's a great story. So this relationship between this scientist and the CIA continued, as we said, for more than a decade, about 14 years. And he got paid a lot of money. Money went into a bank account, and so he became very rich. One of the things he did with his money was he bought 2 houses. So he had 2 houses for his 2 wives, and they could have a bit of separation between them and make his life a little bit better. And I guess he went from one house to the other. Because he was, accustomed to living very well, he ended up, doing some more typical low-grade corruption, some, taking kickbacks from vendors, doing things that would, bring him some money and just kind of grease the skids a little bit. And the Syrians found out about some of his side projects. And so in 2002, they pull him in to question him about some of this activity that they found out about. Eamon panics. So they bring him in for questioning, tell him that they know what he's been doing. He just thinks right away, well, they know all about the CIA stuff. They tell him it's better if you just confess everything, tell us what you did. And he just blurted out the whole story. I've been helping the CIA for years, and nobody else knows about this. My family was involved. This is just my little operation. And they kind of listen with fascination and then just amazement. This guy just essentially ratted himself out. Because he had been such an important figure, and he had sort of been a state hero as well as a traitor, they gave him special treatment and they allowed his family to leave the country. So his wife and his kids are now elsewhere. I wasn't able to figure out where they are exactly, but they left Syria. And he was executed. He was shot by firing squad, which is again unusual because normally the punishment is by hanging. I got a lot of this color and detail, which is extraordinary because it's never been made public, came from Syrians who worked with him. And I ended up, one of the great lucky finds was connecting with one of his former colleagues who's now out of the country, and disclosed, shared a lot of this detail because they watched it all up close. This man was a former friend and colleague of Eamon's and saw the whole thing unfold. So it was remarkable to get not just the agency's point of view or people who had worked at the agency, but people who were on the other side and saw it all come down. I just as the reason that you only see a first name for Eamon, and the reason you don't see a photo of him, is because there are concerns about his family, that people, if the surname is listed, it might make it easier for somebody to figure out that, yeah, this is his wife living in England or wherever they are. And there could be reprisals either by opposition folks or by the Syrians themselves or any number of actors. So I agreed, even though I know his name and know a lot of details about him, well, I agreed not to use him for security purposes for the family.
Well, that is actually, I believe that Edward Toole may be trying to ask a question, and that'll be probably the last question that we have, unless anyone else has one. But while I wait for that question, I am going to run the raffle right now. And I've already pulled the names, so I'd like to congratulate, and I've verified that they're still here, Jeannie Klein, as well as KT Brill. Both of you will be receiving a copy of the book, and I do want to reiterate that if anyone would like a book plate, those details on how to receive one will be sent out in the follow-up email that will be sent out tomorrow. Oh, and actually, I do now have Edward Toole's questions. Those came in. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and throw those in right now as well. So can a conventional autopsy determine sarin as the cause of death? And the second part of his question is, what are those round items on your desks? Evidently someone doing some looking around.
Oh, very cool. One of the crazy things about my life is that when I do TV stuff for the poster for the book, we're all kind of in our Zoom rooms now, and I've been rated by Rate My Room, and so people kind of pick out little details. It was a good rating, I must say. I was happy that people like my desk, but yeah, I get questions about the little knickknacks. The sarin question first. Yeah, it actually, sarin itself can be found, but sarin also produces, when it reacts with human tissues, some very significant, very clear signatures, chemical signatures. And so that's one of the easiest things was to figure out that, yeah, this person was exposed to sarin. You'll see if you read the book, there's this extraordinary story of one of those early chemical weapons attacks. This one, a couple of tear gas canisters filled with sarin that fall on a village in northern Syria in 2013. One person was killed, a woman, 52-year-old woman with grandchildren and kids, just happens to land in a courtyard outside her house, and she inhales the sarin. Some of her other family members get less of it; they get sick, but she ends up dying. But in the desperation to get help for this woman, her family brings her across the border into Turkey, and so she's able. They're hoping to get medical help for her, but she dies en route or dies soon after she gets across the border. But because she died in Turkey, there was a body that the Turks had, and they bring her to a hospital. She's put on ice, and later on, autopsies are conducted. And one of the first bits of really conclusive evidence that this was a sarin case came when the UN comes with its investigators, order an autopsy, take tissue samples, take multiple, controlled samples to make sure that nothing's been tampered with. And send the results to multiple laboratories, just as for quality control, and they come back with incontrovertible evidence that it was sarin, not just the byproducts, but they found actual real sarin that hadn't broken down yet inside the woman's lungs. So that was remarkable. So my little buttons, these are commemorative coins that are all going to fall down as I bring them up to you. But one of the cool things about my job is I get to, have interviews with some pretty interesting people. And so this is a commemorative coin from the CIA. So David Petraeus, who was the former CIA director and obviously the former military commander, gave me this when I went to a CIA dinner. And so I've got a real mix of these from all kinds of agencies, from FBI, Treasury, different sort of intelligence agencies that do our, work for our government. And, you can't take gifts as a journalist, but little commemorative coins, they're essentially just metal mementos. And I've collected them over years. So I've got a great little collection of them. I've got a few other choice items. One that I'm sort of proud of, I guess you could say proud, but it's just a bit spooky. But this is an ISIS flag that was flown over the town of Raqqa in Syria. And a special forces guy who became a source and a friend brought this home after one of his trips overseas and said, "Here, have a souvenir." So I've amassed quite a few interesting relics and artifacts from my reporting adventures over the years.
All right, I think we have one last question that's kind of slid in from Michelle Wang, and that is, does Syria still have the capability to make sarin?
They do, because they know the recipe. The difficult part is the precursors. There's, as you'll see in the book, the binary sarin, which is what the Syrians made. It's essentially, think of it as peanut butter and jelly. So you have most of the stuff is peanut butter, and then you add jelly at the last minute, add those two together, and you've got this dangerous product. The last product, the jelly, is just isopropyl alcohol. It's the most common thing in the world to get. So that's not hard. Some of the other stuff that go into the peanut butter, a little bit difficult to get on the market. I mean, because they're controlled substances. You can't just, put in an order to DuPont and say, please send me some of this, because those chemicals are closely tracked. But you can get them, and Syria has allies that make them, like the Iranians, like the Russians, and so it's never going to be beyond Syria's capability to reconstitute its stockpile. The biggest danger is, now that they're so closely watched, they're worried that if they are caught making it, then they're revealed to be the liars that we all know them to be anyway, but it's just going to be very bad for them. I think the thing I worry about, to be honest, the thing that I constantly kind of worry about is the possibility that ISIS figures this out too. And that can happen because we've seen them, and if you read the book, you'll see they get pretty far down the road. They get far enough that they're testing chemical weapons against the Kurds. They have an intention to use them. Osama bin Laden once said it was a religious duty of Al-Qaeda to use weapons of mass destruction, so they want to do it. They've issued statements, proclamations saying that they really would like to carry out a chemical attack. And so that will exist. There's knowledge out there within that community. And there's also things that they can do that are not sarin, but still pretty bad. Near the end of the book, there's this really terrible story about an attempt by ISIS to make a chemical weapon and blow it up in Sydney, Australia. And they got the sort of the helpers. They got two guys in the suburbs of Sydney, Australia, who were willing to put the ingredients together. They had something that would really work. It was just ordinary chemicals that you can buy at a hardware store, that if you combine them together in the right ratios, you can kill people in enclosed space. And they had all the parts of this terrorist attack lined up and ready. They'd even had this other aspect of the plot, which was going to be a bomb exploded on a plane. And to show you what great people they are, they drafted their own brother unknowingly to carry the bomb onto this plane. He was going to fly to Lebanon. They didn't like him. It turns out he was gay, and because of that, he was the black sheep of the family. And so they planted a bomb in his luggage and dropped him off the airport and said, "See ya," and had their own brother carry this sort of altitude-sensitive bomb onto a plane. It gets caught by a baggage check person who thinks the bag feels a little bit too heavy and wants to screen it. And that is the only reason that this big, I think it was Etihad Airlines plane didn't go crashing into the Pacific Ocean someplace. But I guess the bottom line is Syria could do it if it wants to. There's also a real possibility that other bad actors, including terrorist groups might want to do this and could figure out a way to do it if they really put their minds to it. Sorry about wow, this is really not happy hour now. I'm really very sorry about that, but it's the reality of our world, unfortunately.
Well, I think that sums up the questions. Thank you for the presentation, for taking some time, the generosity of it going through our questions. Now I'd like to introduce the executive director of our organization, Karen Karpovich, to say a few words. Karen?
Thank you, Joby, so much. I listened to your wonderful, wonderful storyteller, but the reality I kept having to say to myself is, yes, this is stories, but this is our reality too. And we sometimes forget about the Middle East and what's going on, being caught up in our own lives and what's going on in this country, but it's still the powder keg that it is. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and good luck on your books, because you're a wonderful, wonderful writer, obviously, and a great storyteller. I hope they make it. And I could say, I know that gentleman who wrote that story. Congratulations to the two individuals who won the book. I'm sure it's going to be a good read, and I hope that we all get an opportunity to read your book and any of your others that come along. Thank you again. And I'd like to thank Will Jordan from our Philadelphia branch, along with Judith Francis, for making this happen. Thank you so much. It was an important event and a reminder of who we are and where we are. So thank you again. I'd like to also remind everyone, the views of people that don't know, that the English Speaking Union is a membership organization. So when you fill out your survey today, if you're not a member, I encourage you to become one. With programs like this and new ones coming up as the months progress. I also wanted to mention the fact that our next program will be a little different, a little bit of a different event. It's on May 21st, and it's being produced by our Kansas City branch, Jeff Schnabel, and that team, and it's going to take us back to Kansas City in the 1920s. And a woman named Carly Dean will be joining us, talking about the gangsters and the bootleggers of the 1920s Kansas City. So I hope you come. It's going to be on May 21st at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And it sounds like it should be interesting and fun, and just another testament to the diversity and the history of the English-speaking Union. Thank you all so much, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you all. Take care.